Okay. So what happens when you have a lot of material between your foot and the ground, whether it's cushion or the air from an Air Max, is you are creating this sensory disconnect between the nerves and the surface, and then really the stimulation that's coming in from the ground to your nervous system. An important concept that ties into this is that every time we strike the ground, we are experiencing ground reaction forces, and those ground reaction forces are perceived as vibration. So vibration is a extremely powerful stimulus that comes into your feet and into your nervous system. As soon as you put cushion, Air Max material between the foot and the ground, it is actually absorbing the vibration. And we use vibration to build bone density, to stimulate the loading response, to actually force your intrinsic muscles of your foot to contract. So there's a lot of sensory, neuromuscular, motor responses that are built off of sensory input. And if you're not getting sensory input, you are moving in this very disconnected way. Or I often say that your body is moving without all of the pieces to the puzzle, right? Like you'll find a way to move, but are you moving as optimally or as efficiently as you could be? And with the athletes, this is huge because you're talking about like the 1%, right? You need the millisecond, and cushion in footwear or tapping into the sensory side of the foot could be where that millisecond is lying.
And then so with that, kind of working our way up the chain, one of the things you discuss in your book, Barefoot Strong, is about how the foot is coupled to movements going up in the knee and the hip. And, one of the things that we see, we work with a lot of volleyball players, and, a few years ago, someone's knees went into valgus. I think people called the police and everybody panicked and everything happened. And now it's starting to move away from that a little bit. Can you discuss how, or the connection between your foot, the ground, and then working up the chain?
Yeah. So kinematically, which is the joint coupling that you're describing, every time your foot moves, and if the listeners want to stand up and kind of go through this with me, they totally can. But if you're standing and you roll your feet to the outside, which means you're inverting or supinating, right? And then you roll your foot to the inside, which you're everting and pronating, and you kind of go back and forth, you will see or feel that the knees are going in, this valgus that you were referencing. So the knees coming in is because the tibia was rotating in, and that was associated with the eversion or pronation of the foot. This continues all the way up the chain, that you're going to get rotation of the femur, the pelvis is going to rock forward. Technically, that goes all the way up into spinal and T-spine rotation as well. And we go back and forth. So if we go into the inversion supination, everything kind of externally rotates. The pelvis goes into a posterior tilt, and then it unlocks the pelvis in a different way. This interconnected joint coupling is how you transfer energy. It's also how you optimize mechanical patterns for power and force production. That's one aspect of feet and foot function that I think is the most focused on. And then I always, again, not to keep tying it back to sensory, but then that's why I would add in a layer of sensory on top of that. And like the fascial lines and the perception of the body through the stimulus of the fascia is kind of woven on top of mechanics. I try to not just look at mechanics, but adding in this layer on top. Or maybe it's like one's the cake, this is the icing. Or one's the foundation, the rest is the scaffolding within the body.
That makes a lot of sense. Would you say, or have you noticed that in more elastically driven athletes, I think of Giannis Antetokounmpo, I think is how you say his name, but he's a basketball player, right? Picture of him at the free throw line shooting, and his knees are just basically going towards each other. He's also 6'11", but he's also one of the best athletes in the NBA. Do you find in more elastically driven athletes that you see more of that valgus in the knees, or do you see more of that rotation through the foot? Is that something that's connected?
You definitely can. So I would say the extreme form of high elasticity or connective tissue elasticity would be in like Ehlers-Danlos. So I actually treat people who have connective tissue disorders. This is also like contortionists who have extreme flexibility actually have a form of connective tissue disorder. Now, from the rubber band effect, right, he's really optimizing the energy transfer demands of the fascial and the tendon system within the body. And the way that you load that is, you have to go down to go up. You have to flex to extend. And I think when you see, especially on like slow motion camera or high speed cameras, you're seeing what the naked eye isn't able to see. And there's probably a lot more deviations into these improper positions, like the knee valgus that you referenced, that people would be like, oh my God. But it's the only way that they're able to harness that energy. I know there's slow motion videos of high jumpers and pole vaulters that you can see on YouTube about the foot, and they're completely just like bottoming out their arch compression into their posterior tibialis and their plantar fascia. And at first glance, if you look at that, you're just like, how are they not rupturing that tissue or, tearing things or injuring themselves? But the connective tissue has those properties within it, right? And it's really just the physics of energy transfer.
Yeah, that's something that I was always interested in. Again, like a few years ago, it was, when I was learning, it was always, always have this perfect joint alignment when someone's jumping. And then as you study these athletes, you see that's not always the case. One question that I wanted to ask you too, you see a lot of stability pads. People use stability pads. We can think of many names of them, many brands. How does that affect the sensory input to the nerves in the foot using something like a soft foam pad?
Yes. So you're talking like an Aerox pad.
Yeah.
Okay. Or we'll keep it non-branded. Okay, sorry.
That's okay.
Non-branded, a piece of foam. Okay. So you're on it to create this unstable environment, right? To try to challenge the neuromuscular system to create stabilization strategies to maintain the balance, right? It is really what's happening. People might not realize it. Now, as soon as you do that, you have damped the mechanoceptive and the proprioceptive feedback. You've thrown it off. You've disrupted it, right? Now, if that is your goal, is you are then teaching the athlete or the individual to tap into the other input systems. So let me go back a step for you and for the listeners, is that when I teach about the neurosensory approach to balance and stabilization, I think about the four main input systems and how we maintain balance. Visual, vestibular, and auditory is technically in there. Proprioceptive, which are your joints, and then mechanoceptive, which is touch or the bottom of the foot and the palm of the hand. When you disrupt any of those 4 or 5 input systems, what is done is that the nervous system upregulates the remaining systems. So I often say there's this pie, and you have to make a pie. You have to complete the pie. You got your 4 systems, visual, vestibular, proprioceptive, mechanoceptive. They're making up the pie. I put you on an Aerox pad or a piece of foam. I took away or I disrupted mechanoceptive, proprioceptive. So that leaves you with 2 to make up the difference to fill this pie, right? The sensory input system that people default to from a dominance is visual. That is by far the go-to strategy to maintain balance on something unstable when you disrupt mechanoceptive and proprioceptive is they really, really, really upregulate visual. So then what this means is, does that skill of standing on an Aerox pad to challenge stability and upregulate visual transfer into the sport or prevent a recurrent ankle sprain? I don't know. This is where the research is very inconsistent on the efficacy or the transfer of doing training like that. Now, the way that I would approach this just from a neurosensory perspective, and I focus on really sensory stacking and accessing all of these input systems so the nervous system wins, is I would say, okay, if someone is on an Aerox pad, I'd want them barefoot because I want them at least closer to the ground. But if they're in their shoes, I need the Naboso insole in their shoe. So at least I'm connecting to the foot mechanoceptively somehow. Could I put kinesiology tape around the ankle? So I'm still accessing and turning the noise up proprioceptively while I'm disrupting it. What is in their hands? Access these nerves by holding something. Our sensory sticks are weighted and textured. Have something in the hands. And then that is going to help you find strategies that are not too visually dominant.
Okay. So you see people sometimes doing like the same idea, but eyes closed, right? Kind of some, taking away the visual system. Is that the same idea where the other systems will upregulate?
Yeah, and that's called sensory conflict training. So when you have an athlete or an individual shut their eyes, you got your pie again, right? I shut the eyes, I took away visual. You are essentially saying, okay, I'm taking away visual and I'm having you in a unstable position. I'm perturbing you or something. You are then saying, okay, nervous system, I need you to upregulate and turn the volume up to mechanoceptive, proprioceptive, or vestibular. Even at that, I want to help the nervous system. And I would say, use Naboso, be on a harder surface, have something in the hands, use kinesiology tape, put compression apparel on the athlete. And I'm trying to help upregulate as much as we can, because at the end of the day, the most successful neurosensory or neuromuscular strategies are those that you can perceive the body and neurosensorily these different parts of the body, right? So I want to train the body how to create these different strategies versus disrupting it, taking away a lot of the information, and then essentially saying, figure it out, right? Nervous system, figure it out, right? Like that's not how I want an athlete to be. I want them to be really tapped into this mind-body connection, and that's what it's creating, right? It could be even interoceptively. If you put someone on an unstable surface, an Eric's pad, and you're kind of shutting the eyes and challenging them, get them to focus into their breath, which is another sensory input system of how we navigate this physical body in space. And it'll help that athlete in the bigger picture, because body perception is necessary to controlling athletic performance.
And so you'll tie in basically other sensory inputs. You don't just, like you mentioned earlier, hey, good luck, you can't see now, or you're balancing on this pad that is, extremely unstable. Good luck. You're actually tying in the other systems in there, other sensory input.
100%. Yep. And I obviously love Naboso because I developed it, but I'm very fascinated with texture, but there's also different vibration. There's kinesiology tape. Before I do perturbation type training with athletes, I want them to do dry brushing or do something. Like, you have to wake up all of these nerves that are on your skin, wear compression apparel, wear wrist weights, try to hack into the nervous system by understanding really the complexity of how powerful it is versus just thinking it's, if I go on a wobble board and I shut the eyes, that's going to transfer. Not really.
So speaking of Naboso, so one of the reasons why that kind of spurred me to reach out to you, which I'd wanted you to have you on the show for a while, but I was on the Zero Shoes website, and I'm a big fan of what they do. I enjoy their shoes, and you have a product on there. Would you mind, I guess, speaking maybe to that product that you have with the Naboso tech, and then maybe talking about some of the science behind Naboso?
Yes, so Naboso is a sensory product line that I developed a little over 4 years ago, and all of our products are designed to stimulate the nerves in the bottom of the feet and the palm of the hand, which are mechanoceptors, so they're tactile nerves, touch nerves, and we are targeting very specifically what's called the SA1 Merkel disc, which is sensitive to texture or two-point discrimination. So I'll show you one of the insoles. And if you are on the video, you'll be able to see there's little tiny pyramids across the entire surface. This is on every single one of our products. Our design patents are around two-point discrimination through a pyramidal pattern. That's what our innovation is behind. And a similar analogy to what we are stimulating would be Braille. So when your finger is reading Braille, the nerve, the same nerve, the SA1 Merkel disc in the finger, is reading Braille because of the differentiation of the dots. It's reading the 2 points. And that pattern is something that the brain recognizes. So we are utilizing that and say that our products are almost like Braille for the feet. Okay. Now our products range from insoles. We have socks. We have flooring, we have mats, we have a sensory stick that is weighted, we have a release tool. These are our socks, so the inside of the sock. This is not the outside, it's on the inside. And we have a couple partnerships. So Zero Shoes actually licenses our material, and it's the top layer of their trail sandal. And then they carry all of our products on their website as well. We have a release ball, so we have a neuro ball. And again, the intent is to activate, strengthen, and recover the feet, and technically the hands, because same nerves, through this 2-point discrimination pattern. We work with many professional athletes because they're looking for faster foot awareness. They're looking for more efficient foot recovery. They're looking to connect to the sensory side of recovery and movement. So we've really kind of tapped into that performance space. And then the whole other side of our business is medical. And that's neuro rehab. That's people who have had a stroke, MS, Parkinson's. And it's very easy to see why these products would help someone within that space.
So when would you utilize something like the Naboso technology? You mentioned recovery. Would you utilize that as pre-session, in-session, post-session, all the above?
Really, it would be all the above, right? So let's give an example of the activation. So to me, the movement prep, or what you do the first 15 minutes of the session or your training period, is, in my opinion, the most important, because you're trying to prime the nervous system. You're waking it up. You're doing maybe some eye movement exercises. I don't know what you're doing, but I'm trying to get the brain ready for movement. So that would be doing things barefoot on the Naboso mat so that you can wake up and activate those nerves. I teach different foot activation techniques that combine foot to pelvic floor to diaphragm. So they're really specific fascial postural activation techniques. And I do them barefoot on the mat. So that would be one example. Now, let's say you're doing some Olympic lifts and you want to be really connected to your foundation. You could put our insoles into your Olympic lifting shoes or your training shoes, and then you will just continue to learn to find stability and force from the ground up, because it is forcing you to feel your feet, feel your weight distribution. Are you collapsing to the inside, or are you on your tripod? So it's a very good cueing tool, because the texture allows you to actually feel where your pressure is on your feet and how you're pushing out of, let's say, a squat would be one way. And then finally, with the recovery, could be, the neural ball. You're releasing your feet at the end. Maybe you're walking around when you're not in the gym or on the field in our insoles, and it's like a mini massage. Technically, our socks are recovery socks, so they're compressive, and we say that they support the massage, the compression, and then they improve circulation as well, which is an important part of recovery.
So I know one of the things that you have talked about in some of your videos is doing short foot, but then integrating it with the core and other aspects, glutes. Can you talk a little bit about maybe if you were to do that on a Naboso, how you might advance that into, besides just doing your standard, short foot?
Yes. So sensory drives muscle contractions. And what is going to hit this home for some of the listeners of how sensory stimulation drives muscle contractions is research that is done in the minimal footwear space, such as Zero Shoes, Vivo Barefoot, any of the other brands that the listeners may like, that is now demonstrating that wearing minimal shoes is an effective way to improve small foot muscle strength, or intrinsic foot strength. So you can now say minimal shoes are a foot strengthening tool. Right? That's awesome. I love it. Sensory drives muscle contractions and strength. So if you are doing a foot activation, such as short foot, I always teach it barefoot because I want nice spread splaying of the foot and articulation of the digits. Then you can go into your shoe. But once we activate, we're going to be barefoot. If you do that on the Naboso mat and you add in more sensory, you're just driving that sensory drive strength kind of pathway even more, right? And oftentimes when I lecture, I say, if I can check more boxes with every exercise that I do, why would I not do that? Right? Like if I can hit the brain more and wake up the nervous system by just doing one extra thing for an exercise I'm doing anyway, why would I not do that? Right? Like it's just, I love 2 for exercise. It's like it's 2 for 1. You get check this box, that box. Love it. I'm a New Yorker by heart, so I'm very like time is money. I gotta let's like wake up the system in the most effective way because let's get moving and grooving, right? So I'm very efficient in techniques that I teach and I integrate because again, like why not? Why would you not want to do that?
I don't want to spend an hour and a half in the gym. So, why not incorporate multiple aspects? Okay. So now you'll incorporate it, some of the stuff you do is just like a transverse abdominal or like a pelvic floor contraction or like a lunge or not a lunge, but like a single leg squat, these types of movements.
Yes. And the stack, we'll call it the stabilization stack that I teach, is between pushing the toes down, which is technically short foot. So when the toes push down, the intrinsics in the foot contract, but you're also continuing up the deep front fascia line into the pelvic floor. Not everyone's pelvic floor is going to contract when you push the toes down. Like the listeners could do that now and just push your toes into the floor. If you're like, I don't feel anything in my core, right? You may need to consciously drive it. So I teach people as soon as those toes go down, I need you to lift your pelvic floor. And it's actually your posterior pelvic floor. So I need you to lift your levator ani. And you need to just lift it. As soon as those digits go down, I need your levator ani to go up. And there is research showing that there's a muscle synergy, central nervous system muscle synergy between the big toe and your posterior pelvic floor lifting. So toes down, pelvic floor lift. Your posterior pelvic floor, which is your levator ani, blends into your glute muscles. So you want strong glutes, you got to get into your posterior pelvic floor. And then to further stack that, I would have it driven through the diaphragm. So I would want a very intentional breathing pattern. So I would want you to exhale as you push your toes down and as you're lifting your levator ani. So it's happening all at the same time.
What would be the cue to activate that posterior pelvic floor?
So it would be stopping your poo.
That works.
I don't know any other way to explain it, but it is a lift that once you connect to it, to that sensation, and let's say, you're about to do like a back squat, right? So you're on the bottom phase of a squat. Drive the toes down, all 5 toes, not just the big toes, drive them down. And as soon as you do that, you should feel, the levator ani or the stopping the poo kind of action, that lift. And now you're ready to lift. So just from a sequencing, if I was doing, I'd stand up and do it.
Sure.
Sorry. If I'm doing it, get very involved fitness person. Is if I'm down and I push my toes down and I lift my levator ani, now I'm set, right? Then when I push out of the squat, I'm going to go shh, and I'm going to lift that way. But first I need to kick it on with the toe pelvic floor, and then I hold that while I'm pushing out of the squat. Or swinging the kettlebell or doing the bicep curl or whatever it is.
So one of the cues that I used to hear a lot at the bottom of a squat is to kind of, people would say spread the floor. So essentially I think they're supinating their foot, or they're externally rotating at the hips. Is that something you would not recommend? Does that take away the natural movement of the foot of when you actually squat down?
Okay, so the reason why I'm not a huge fan of that cue, again, it's a cue that people connect to and it works, right? So if you're like, what is the easiest way to prevent someone from collapsing into too much of a valgus and overpronation, and then they just kind of destabilize the entire chain? It's a quick thing that people get, boom, it kind of sets their foundation. However, when we think about, we stand and we kind of pronate and the knee goes in because the tibia is going in, do you see that I'm rotating?
Mm-hmm.
So it's actually a transverse plane moment that is happening. When you tell me to correct a transverse plane moment through a frontal plane cue, it's not making sense to me. Like, it's not connecting from an optimization of human movement, right? Did you get an effect? Sure. But when you tear the ground, I just pushed into my lateral line. And depending on the foot type of the individual or their baseline fascial tightness, I'm really loading that IT band and the lateral glutes and the perineals in a way that may not be efficiently loading their system. So I would rather someone kind of corkscrew and find that is more of a rotational correction than a frontal plane correction.
That makes sense. I haven't thought about it in those terms. Like I didn't think about that as like a frontal plane cue, but it definitely is. You had mentioned foot types, and I didn't know if we were going to get into this because I know there's a whole lot that you could spend many podcasts talking about foot types. But would you be able to give maybe a brief overview or discussing the different foot types that you see?
Let me put it in the most simple way initially, and then we can kind of go down some more paths if you would like. From a simplest form, you have three main buckets. That you have your flat foot bucket, which is really not a term that I use, but we'll just call it flat foot right now. You have a neutral foot, and then you have the high arch bucket. Now, this flat foot bucket can be broken down into different types of flat feet, but really they're different types of overpronation because flat foot isn't really telling me the biomechanical story or imbalance that's actually happening in the foot. But by design, a flatter foot or an overpronated foot is going to be a little less stable. It's what you consider unlocked. So the foundation is unlocked and inherently less stable, and it's inherently a little bit slower. Now, I'm making associations. This is not A equals B. These are just generalizations, okay? But technically, those are the characteristics. Neutral is neutral, right? Sitting in the middle. Over here on the higher arch side is where you could say supination, or the medical term is actually cavus, so a high arch foot. Now, functionally and characteristically, that is more of a rigid foot. So it's really tight, really locked, doesn't have good timing as far as destabilizing and allowing energy and impact forces to come into it. So it is susceptible to different injury or stress than the flatter overpronated foot over here. So you have kind of distinct differences between them. The flatter, unlocked, unstable, overpronated foot, technically I focus on stabilization techniques, activation, short foot, foot to core. I want to teach them how to find neutral, which they can do through just conscious control of the foot. And then over here, the high arch supinated cavus foot that is rigid. I'm teaching it how to unlock and bring fascial mobility to it. I'm bringing sensory awareness so that it doesn't experience stress fractures and shin splints because it doesn't take that impact well. And I'm always making sure that both of these foot types over here are connected into the hips, because if someone has an unstable foot, they almost always have an unstable pelvis. If someone has a really rigid, locked foot, oftentimes they have rigid, tight, locked hips and pelvis. Ooh, I don't hear you.
Muted myself. Sorry about that. I was going to say, do you see people more with the flatter foot type, or do you see people more with the higher arch? What type of, as far as I don't know if a percentage, but do most people come in saying, hey, I have flat feet. Doctor told me one time, I'm here to see you. Is that usually what happens, or is it the other way?
I would say more people tend to deviate towards this overpronated, unlocked, unstable foot. Doesn't mean that I don't see varying types of supination, cavus foot imbalances, but really the listeners are probably going to encounter more of this overpronation side. And then that's where you would dive in a little bit more and really want to understand the different types of what are under there. There are reasons that we have overpronation because of ligament laxity. So it's actually not a muscle strength issue. It's ligament laxity, which is quote unquote genetic. It could be an actual muscle strength issue. Some of it could be that it's just rigid and there's no flexibility or manipulation of that foot across the board. And then some people have what I call a pancake foot, which is a special flat foot that is not overpronation or rotational in any way. It is actually just a flat foot in the sagittal plane is the only way that I can explain it. It's like the arch just dropped literally sagittally straight down and there's no rotation. So those are some of the most common ones that you see. And we want to make sure that we're not treating all flat feet the same. We really need to dive in there and understand these differences, which is part of what I teach other professionals and coaches to do.
And I believe you have in your book a way, I think, to photograph right from behind, see where your Achilles lines up to determine kind of, or at least kind of get close to what type of foot you have.
Yes. And there's a website that links to my book, which is called barefootstrong.com. And you can take that foot type quiz online. You just need to take pictures of your own foot.
Or get a friend, to maybe
get a friend, take a video and then stop it. Yeah.
So what advice would you have for practitioners, whether you're coach, strength coach, whatever you may be, so we can maybe address the foot in a little bit more efficient or effective way? I feel like personally, just kind of having my pulse on the industry, I don't know that it's people are becoming more aware of it, but prior to me engaging with your material, I know I wasn't aware of the importance. Do you have any advice or takeaways for people to more effectively treat the foot?
Not to promote a product of mine, but I would say read Barefoot Strong because it's a very easy read, right? So
I can say it is
small book, but I try to put a lot of little pearls in there to start the curiosity process. And I feel that you have to be curious about this very complex part of the human body, especially from a movement perspective. And as soon as you start getting into the mechanical side and then you get into the sensory side, both of them are very complex that you have to come in with a curiosity. And then I teach courses. So EBFA Global, we have online courses. I teach courses in person and it's really starting the learning process. I do not consider Instagram education. You do need to take an actual education course. And, I think that it is starting with the baseline. If you just get people out of their shoes and start to release the feet and understand short foot, just as a baseline, that's an awesome step one. Right? Just get people connecting and recovering the feet and maybe do a little bit of an activation. As you dive down the rabbit hole or to learn more is start to learn more about this integrated concept. Learn about the fascial lines that run and cross and interconnect on the bottom of the foot. And then start to get into the more complex anatomy and foot typing and foot assessments, because ultimately that's what you need to do. And that's where I see most of the misconceptions, or they're kind of looking just at the tip of the iceberg and don't know the massive iceberg that's actually sitting under the water, is when we do take things just kind of a literal face value. The foot is really the iceberg under the water that you can't see.
And of course, I'll link to all this information for the listeners out there to go directly to all those products and everything you just mentioned. As we start to wrap up, I do have a question. So some people will say, like, say you're training, or you're playing a sport where there's a lot of volume. Is there ever an instance when more padding is necessary? When, let's just say, a minimalist shoe like a Zero or whatever Vivo would not be ideal if you're playing a certain sport or doing a certain type of activity?
100%. So you always want to match the footwear that we choose and the level of cushion or the level of support or the drop or whatever features within the footwear that you're looking at to the foot type, the activity, and the injury history. Those are the three things that I look at and say, maybe because of your extreme ligament laxity and navicular drop and a history of plantar fasciitis and you're a marathon runner, maybe you should not be running in zero shoes. I just, I can't say that everything is A or B or X equals Y, because it doesn't work that way. It's too complex. So as much as I love minimal shoes, there are exceptions to certain foot types, certain activities, or certain injury histories that there is not an appropriateness, perhaps, for certain individuals. Let's take the activity, because that's what you had asked, is extreme running or running on surfaces that are not friendly to the foot, like concrete, let's just say. And you're running very long distances in concrete, you are getting excess impact forces or higher impact forces than you should be. And if you remember, ground reaction forces are vibrations. So you are getting a back reverberation every time your foot strikes the ground. If you're starting to get shin splints or you get a stress fracture, I'm not going to be surprised, because you overloaded the system, and you can't blame the shoes. You can't blame, let's say your muscle strength. You were just defying physiology, right? And it's just kind of very simple to that. Now, one other example of where you can think of the impact forces and the appropriateness of it would be not something that's going to involve an activity, but like a day-to-day stress that we experience, and that is standing long hours. So for any of the listeners, is we have our day-to-day stress, which is where most of the breakdown on the body happens. And then we have our activities that we love to do, right? Which is playing the sport, working out, running, whatever it is that you're doing. I look at this as whatever you do during the day with this, every single day, repetitive, 10,000 steps a day, you stand on concrete, maybe you're a trainer and you're standing all day, right? And you're stressing the body. Why waste the stress, the connective tissue or the tissue stress on that? Save it for when you're doing the activity that you love to do, right? So that's where I'll actually say, if you're in cushion because you stand on your feet 8 hours a day, maybe that's okay, because I want you training in your zero shoes or your Vivos so you can optimize your foot function in that situation. But if you wear them in this more unnatural environment, and I've treated many trainers, especially when I was in New York City, and they would be on their feet 8-10 hours a day and believe in the minimal message so much that they didn't want to be seen without their Vivos or their zero shoes on the gym floor all day. And then they get massive plantar fasciitis. And they're like, Dr. Splichal, what is this? Like, I strengthen my feet. I do short foot. And the minimal shoes are supposed to be, natural and help me tap into my natural foot strength. And I was like, listen, you were standing on your feet 10 hours. That's not natural.
Yeah.
Don't blame the shoes. Don't blame your feet. You're doing something that is physiologically not natural. Let's think about that and then go over here and rock it when you're training.
Like most things, people tend to go to extremes. So,
Yes.
I appreciate that answer. That's very insightful. So as we start to wrap this up, where can people reach out to you if they have any questions? I'll link to all the Naboso stuff and obviously the book, but what would be the best step to connect with you?
Yeah, so my medical practice website is my name, so dremilysplichal.com, so my full name. I am on Instagram, dremilydpm. I put lots of content on there, so if you want to start to kind of dabble into the foot awareness, that's on Instagram. Naboso's website is naboso.com, so naboso.com. And we are on Instagram, Naboso_technology. You mentioned my book. That site was barefootstrong.com.
Yes, and I will mention the book again. It is a short read for those of us, that can see this. It is, again, really changed the way I viewed the foot. So even if you're not a coach or a trainer, I think parents, it's written in a way that I think a lot of people can understand. So, but I appreciate you coming on. Thanks for your time. And I really enjoyed this conversation.
Of course. Thank you so much.